Just last week, President Yoon Suk-yeol was in Spain on his first overseas trip to attend a NATO summit as an observer. And there, the president was busy holding a number of bilateral and multilateral summits with world leaders, making known South Korea's will for global solidarity and cooperation. And for the first time in its new strategic concept, NATO described China as a challenge to its interests and security. President Yoon now has to balance his relations with the U.S. and China while dealing with North Korea's nuclear threats. Looking back on the diplomatic significance of his trip to NATO, we connect live to Chung Ku-youn, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Kangwon National University, and Mason Richey, International Politics Professor at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Good morning.
All right, so to start us off, Professor Chung, what do you think were some of the key outcomes of President Yoon's trip to Madrid?
Well, it was a kind of first trip abroad since he became a president, and actually this was a good opportunity to show South Korea's new foreign policy initiative, which is entitled as Global Pivotal States. And this was a kind of nice occasion since South Korea was invited as one of those participants of Asia-Pacific partners of NATO. And it actually shows South Korea will be taking outgoing approach to international affairs, scaling up its international commitment, which distinguishes itself from the previous Moon organization. And South Korea will be on the side of value-driven diplomacy that emphasizes democracy and rule-based order in response to Ukraine crisis in particular. And other accomplishments include South Korea's policies to secure economic security, especially to diversify South Korea's supply chain to reduce its dependency on China. Another accomplishment will be its attempt to address North Korea's denuclearization. Actually, this was a kind of major priority of Yoon administration, that it wants to garner support to South Korea's diplomatic approach to put pressure on North Korea, which will be different from the previous administration also, and focus on economic sanctions and deterrence to North Korea to start a dialogue. And into that effort, South Korea needs more diplomatic support from international community. So all of these three kind of domains and three accomplishments will be a kind of big step for Yoon administration.
Now, Professor Richey, how has Seoul's cooperation with NATO evolved? I mean, what role will it play in supporting the Securities Pact's new strategic concept?
So South Korea's relationship with NATO goes back formally to 2005, when they became a dialogue and cooperation partner. In 2012. This was even further formalized and deepened as South Korea, along with some other countries here in the region, became what they call a global partner, or a partner across the globe. During that time period, South Korea participated in ISAF in a limited capacity in Afghanistan, so the International Security Assistance Force there, with some civil military projects, including reconstruction. Currently today, South Korea is involved with NATO in cooperation in cybersecurity, in security-related civil science projects, some counterterrorism, humanitarian assistance, and disaster relief. So, with respect to this NATO summit, obviously Ukraine was front and center. So that's one of the areas where South Korea, I think, will be expected by its partners in NATO to carry perhaps some increasing burden going forward, not just on sanctions and aid, on non-lethal aid and financial aid, but perhaps also possibly backfilling some weapons, lethal weapons, to some of the countries that have been providing those weapons to Ukraine. We'll see about how that looks going forward. With respect to the strategic concept, one of the major things really that NATO was looking at there was to bolster conventional deterrence and extended nuclear deterrence. South Korea isn't going to have any role to play in that, obviously, because it's not formally a NATO member and it's not covered by the Washington Treaty in that regard. However, in the larger context of the this new strategic concept that includes some Indo-Pacific nations, what we sometimes call the AP4, the Asia-Pacific 4, South Korea, Japan, New Zealand, and Australia, Korea will further, I think, increase its role in NATO as a partner through opening a mission in Brussels, through increasing and building out its cyber cooperation, supply chain resilience, climate change is going to come onto the screen, sharing threat perceptions, especially vis-a-vis China, and perhaps also in the future some maritime security-related cooperation as well.
All right, now, Professor Chung, China obviously wasn't happy with what went on during that NATO meeting. Now, what were your thoughts on China criticizing the Western alliance for labeling China as a systematic challenge?
Well, China already raised grievance on South Korea's attending NATO summit before Yoon administration actually depart to Spain. But as discussed earlier, actually this was discussed by the Washington. China does not have any veto over who can and who cannot be attending the summit. And South Korea's attending to NATO summit was based on its interests to, as I mentioned earlier, to implement its foreign policy initiative of global pivotal states. And all the kind of countries who are attending NATO summit was actually based on their national interest to support the rules-based orders, as mentioned by Professor. And also they are responding collectively to secure these rule-based orders and cherish the value of democracy and human rights. And also we are kind of collectively working together to secure our economic resilience vis-a-vis the current economic crisis. So based on this background, China will have to kind of understand that there is a different understanding about the world order and how the world works. Now, and especially in terms of South Korea's relationship with China, Yoon administration tries to take a more principled approach, which might be distinguish itself from the previous administration. But that does not mean that South Korea will balance against China. We are still a good economic partner. We have bilateral free trade agreement, and we need also support from China to start the dialogue with North Korea. So we are taking a different approach, but that does not mean that we are antagonizing China as a kind of same kind of neighbor in the East Asia.
Now, Professor Richey, though, while the U.S. is a staunch ally of South Korea, China obviously is also South Korea's largest trading partner. So following this NATO summit, I mean, how do you expect President Yoon to balance relations with Beijing and the U.S.?
Yeah, so obviously this is a really important question going forward. And at least during the campaign and to some degree during the first part of the Yoon administration until now, we've seen a relatively robust set of rhetoric as concerns the Korea-China relationship. I think that there's a sort of bubble right now where that's relatively low cost because China is dealing with COVID. It's looking towards a party Congress, which is likely going to install Xi Jinping as the paramount leader, most likely for the rest of his life. And so in between now and then, I think China is not looking for significant trouble. So it's complained some about these rhetorical steps from South Korea, and it's complained some about the relationship that's growing perhaps between South Korea and NATO and some of these Western liberal rules-based countries, but it hasn't really put the screws to Korea yet, like we saw, for instance, in 2017 with the reprisals for the installation of THAAD here. So we don't actually know the answer to this question yet about how South Korea is going to deal with China going forward once China takes a more aggressive posture. What we're already seeing, however, is that South Korea is working rhetorically to tell China that its relationship with the United States and with NATO is not anti-China. Foreign Minister Park Jin has repeated that on numerous occasions. Secondly, South Korea will be selective about where it cooperates with NATO in that regard. And will in certain cases, I think, not take steps that will antagonize China unnecessarily, especially if there's not much value in that for South Korea. And then thirdly, South Korea is going to try to diversify its economic relationship, or continue to diversify its relationship economically with China, away from China into other nations in Southeast Asia and in Europe and other parts of the world.
Now, Professor Chung, let's talk a little bit about North Korea. I mean, obviously, North Korea was a center of the attention at that NATO meeting. So what came out in regards to North Korea, and also where does South Korea stand in all this?
Well, I believe that three countries, U.S., Japan, and South Korea, are primarily working with its deterrence and economic sanctions measures that will be imposed on North Korea. Of course, three countries are open to dialogue with North Korea to start talk about how to start denuclearizations and how to kind of draw a roadmap to that goal. But three countries seems to be agreeing with that the previous administration's approach to North Korea, which is peace initiative, has been actually not working. So in that sense, we are going back to kind of pressuring approach to North Korea to start the kind of dialogue and come to the table. And so in that sense, the three countries will more specifically will talking about economic measures, especially in the UN expert panel, and also they will be discussing conducting surveillance measure over illegal ship-to-ship transfer of goods in the East Sea and East China Sea, and also joint effort to deter North Korea's missile provocations and furthering joint exercise between three countries. But the three countries will be having overlapping these interests, but bilateral relationship with Japan would be a challenge for trilateral cooperations. And South Korea also prefer to expand three countries' cooperation beyond this trilateral. So it will be a challenge to how to address this bilateral kind of long-standing bilateral challenges between Japan and South Korea.
Well, Professor Richey, we want to hear your perspective on that trilateral summit between South Korea, the U.S., and Japan, which took on the sidelines of the NATO summit. I mean, what was your perspective on that? And also, where do you see the bilateral relations, like Professor Chung said, of South Korea and Japan going forward?
Yes, that trilateral relationship is very important for Washington. Washington has made that clear. I can come back to that in just a second. And for the bilateral relationship, I think in part we have to wait for the political calendar to clear up in Japan in July. Early July, there's going to be a House of Councilors election, so an upper house election in the Japanese Diet. And I think once that's over, we're going to see South Korea and Japan really enter into a diplomatic dance on how to improve their bilateral relations. In some sense, both sides are going to want the other side to move first. And so I think there's going to be some very sensitive discussions about how their improving relationship can be framed. Obviously, there's these history issues, whether they go back to the textbooks or dokdo or colonial period labor exploitation. That's something that's going to have to be dealt with in one form or another, and is going to be quite tricky. At the same time, the Yoon administration has been very clear that rhetorically that it wants to deal with those historical issues simultaneously to more forward-looking issues involving cooperation bilaterally and trilaterally on North Korea sanctions and on deterrence against North Korea. And then coming to these larger multilateral questions, trilateral and above, as Professor Chung just mentioned, you have the possibility of South Korea cooperating as a sort of adjunct to some of these Quad working groups, notably on climate change, vaccines, technology, and supply chains. And then looking at the military cooperation, we do see that RIMPAC, the Rim of the Pacific military exercises, which have just started and will go all the way into August, are very likely and are currently scheduled to include some U.S., Japan, South Korea missile defense cooperation. So I see that as one of the ways that we see the trilateral moving forward as well within a larger multilateral context.
All right then, Professor Chung, I mean, how do you evaluate South Korea's standing in the global diplomatic community as a whole?
Well, South Korea's role in the international community has been elevated as it conceived more stakes, and also based on its democratization, economic developments, and all the kind of capacity has contributed to has a much larger role of South Korea. But so far, South Korea's kind of standing in the international community has been pretty bilateral. We are cooperating with other countries and contributing to international public goods in a bilateral manner. So what South Korea, especially current Yoon administration, wants to focus is kind of multilateral approach, as I mentioned, as noticed by the term global pivotal states, we are taking more multilateral, and we have to take a more multilateral approach to international affairs, as now we are under this situation of kind of global power transitions. To that end, we need to have more coalitions and more like-minded countries to focus on our current issues and problems. So in that sense, South Korea needs to be more active in scaling up its commitment. I think that's the direction of foreign policy of current administration. But to that end, South Korea need to put more effort to support the current existing foreign policy, international foreign policy of other countries, and of course the current unilateral and multilateral coalitions and how they are addressing this issue.
All right, that's all the time we have for today. Again, that was Professor Chung Ku-youn at Kangwon National University and Professor Mason Richey at Hankuk University of Foreign Study. Thank you so much for your insights today.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.